Once, these tracks echoed with the roar of Formula One engines. Today, they're silent, ghosts of a forgotten era. From billion-dollar circuits lost in the swamps of Korea to legendary corners now buried under weeds and dust, every abandoned Formula One track has a story and a reason it was left behind. Politics, money, tragedy, or pure bad luck. What really killed these circuits that once defined speed and glory? In this video, we uncover every F1 track that vanished from the calendar and the shocking reasons behind their downfall. Buckle up, this is Formula One's dark side, the forgotten circuits of speed. Don't blink, the lap begins now. One, the Nivelles Ballers, was born from Formula One's growing fear of its own danger. After the terrifying crashes and fatalities that haunted the old Spa-Francorchamps circuit, Belgium sought a modern alternative, a safer, more controlled environment for the country's Grand Prix. Built on the outskirts of Brussels, Nivelles Ballers promised a new era of racing, wide runoffs, smooth tarmac, and modern facilities that prioritize protection over peril. When the circuit first hosted the Belgian Grand Prix in 1972, it was hailed as a symbol of progress. But beneath that clean, clinical design lay a fatal flaw. The track had no soul. It was flat, featureless, and devoid of the natural challenge that had defined Spa's fearsome reputation. As the races unfolded, drivers complained that Nivelles lacked rhythm, fans stayed away from its sterile atmosphere, and organizers struggled with poor attendance and growing debt. Even though the circuit fulfilled every safety requirement of its time, it failed to ignite any excitement. The facilities meant to embody Formula One's future were left unfinished and poorly maintained. By the 1974 Grand Prix, cracks had begun to appear, both in the asphalt and in the faith the racing world had in the venue. The crowds were sparse, the energy absent, and the sense of spectacle gone. It was safe, yes, but lifeless. Not long after that final race, the sport quietly turned its back on Nivelles Ballers. The Belgian Grand Prix moved to Zolder, and the once promising track was left to decay in silence. Over the years, nature crept over the deserted tarmac, swallowing the pit lanes and grandstands that once echoed with roaring engines. Nivelles became a ghost of ambition, a reminder that Formula One, in trying to protect its drivers, nearly forgot what made people fall in love with the danger in the first place. 2. Zolder. Zolder stepped into the spotlight as Belgium's answer to the downfall of Nivelles Ballers, but its story soon darkened into one of Formula One's most tragic chapters. Nestled within the wooded landscapes of Limburg, Zolder had a tighter, more technical layout that offered drivers a mix of speed and challenge. It first hosted the Belgian Grand Prix in 1973 and quickly became a favorite for its lively crowd and compact design. Yet behind the cheering fans and the smell of burning rubber, the track carried a sense of unease. Its narrow pit lanes and outdated infrastructure made it difficult to manage the growing demands of Formula One's evolving safety standards. What began as a symbol of Belgium's racing revival would soon become a scene of horror. In 1981, a dark warning came when a mechanic from Ocello was struck and killed in the pit lane, a brutal reminder that the sport's infrastructure had not kept pace with its speed. The following year brought an even greater tragedy that would haunt Zolder forever. During qualifying for the 1982 Belgian Grand Prix, Ferrari driver Gilles Villeneuve, one of Formula One's most electrifying talents, collided with Johan Mass at terrifying speed. Villeneuve's car was launched into the air, disintegrating upon impact and throwing him violently from the wreckage. The paddock fell silent. Gilles Villeneuve, the fearless Canadian known for his heart and heroics, died from his injuries. The incident sent shockwaves across the world, and Zolder's name was forever tied to his death. After that, the circuit's reputation began to crumble. Drivers openly criticized the poor facilities and dangerous pit layout. Organizers struggled with logistics, and fans could not shake the shadow of tragedy. When Spa-Francorchamps, newly renovated and modernized, reopened in 1983, Formula One finally had a reason to leave Zolder behind. The Belgian Grand Prix returned to Spa, and Zolder's final race came in 1984, ending its turbulent chapter in F1 history. Today, the track still hosts smaller events, but the ghosts of its past linger in every corner. For those who remember Villeneuve's final lap, Zolder remains not just an abandoned venue, but a solemn reminder of the thin line between glory and grief in the world of racing. 3. Riemsbucht. Riemsbucht was one of those circuits that captured the raw essence of early Formula One. Long straights, deafening engines, and a reckless sense of speed that bordered on madness. Carved from public roads in the Champagne region of France, it wasn't a purpose-built racetrack, but a thrilling stretch of tarmac, winding through open countryside and small villages. When Formula One first came to Reims in 1950, it became synonymous with power and endurance. Cars blasted down mile-long straights where top speeds exceeded 300 kilometers per hour, and the roar of engines echoed across vineyards and fields. It was fast, beautiful, and perilous, the kind of place where courage and survival were the same thing. But as the years went by, Formula One began to outgrow the dangerous romance of open-road circuits. Reims offered no real protection, just straw bales, thin fences, and hope. The slightest mistake at those speeds could be fatal, and the corners that once tested skill became death traps for the growing horsepower of 1960s machines. Spectators stood frighteningly close to the action, separated by little more than hay or wire, and accidents often spilled into the crowd. The circuit, though adored for its speed and atmosphere, became increasingly out of place in a sport that was slowly learning the price of its recklessness. The final years were marked by tragedy. In 1966, during a support race for the French Grand Prix, multiple drivers were killed in brutal accidents that underlined just how unsafe Reims had become. The deaths silenced any remaining argument for keeping the circuit alive. Officials and teams agreed that the time for such dangerous tracks had passed. Formula One never returned, and the last echoes of Grand Prix engines faded into the French countryside. Today, the remnants of Riemsbucht still stand. The crumbling pit buildings, faded advertisements, and time-worn grandstands left frozen in history. They are monuments to an era when bravery meant flirting with death on every lap. Though long abandoned, the spirit of Reims still lingers in those ruins, a ghostly reminder for Rouen Les Essarts. Rouen Les Essarts was one of the most stunning yet treacherous circuits in Formula One's early years. Carved through the rolling forest near Normandy, it combined fast straights with sweeping downhill curves that demanded absolute precision from drivers. When F1 first raced there in 1952, the circuit's beauty was undeniable. Sunlight flickering through the trees as cars roared through narrow bends, the sound echoing across the valleys. But beneath that elegance lay danger. The track was built entirely on public roads, with steep drops, blind corners, and almost no safety barriers. To race at Rouen meant flirting with fate. Every lap a balance between bravery and survival. As the sport evolved, so did the speed of the cars, but Rouen never changed. The circuit's narrow layout and lack of runoff areas turned it into a death trap. Fans stood frighteningly close to the action, separated only by straw bales and fences. In 1968, tragedy struck in the most horrifying way. During the French Grand Prix, French driver Joe Schlesser lost control of his magnesium-bodied Honda on a fast downhill section. The car burst into flames, burning intensely and uncontrollably. Schlesser was killed instantly, and the sight of the fire seared itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. That day, Rouen's legacy was written not in victory, but in smoke and sorrow. After Schlesser's death, Rouen's future in Formula One was finished. The circuit's natural beauty could no longer hide its deadly flaws. Officials deemed it too risky, and as F1 shifted toward purpose-built tracks with proper safety features, Rouen was left behind. By the 1970s, it had fallen silent, its once glorious roads reclaimed by nature and time. Today, fragments of the old circuit still exist as public roads, winding quietly through countryside, a haunting reminder of an era when speed ruled over safety, and when heroes raced not against time, but against mortality itself. 5. Charade, Clermont-Ferrand. The Charade circuit, carved into the volcanic hills near Clermont-Ferrand in central France, was a masterpiece of natural beauty and danger intertwined. Often called the French Nürburgring, it snaked through twisting mountain roads with breathtaking elevation changes and blind bends that tested even the bravest drivers. When Formula One arrived in 1965, competitors were awestruck by its flowing rhythm and scenic backdrop. Lush greenery, distant peaks, and a ribbon of asphalt that seemed to dance across ancient volcanic terrain. But beneath that beauty lurked peril. The surface littered with jagged volcanic stones, constantly tore into tires, turning every race into a high-speed gamble. Drivers described Charade as one of the most demanding circuits ever created, both exhilarating and exhausting. Each lap was a relentless challenge, with corners that never seemed to end and no room for error. But as the races went on, the track's deadly flaws grew impossible to ignore. Small shards of volcanic rock would splinter tires mid-race, sending debris flying at terrifying speeds. Many drivers finished races with bruised faces and cracked visors from stones hurled off the wheels ahead. In the 1972 French Grand Prix, Helmut Marko's career ended when a rock shattered his visor and permanently damaged his eye, a chilling reminder that at Charade, danger wasn't just around the corner, it was literally in the air. After that race, Formula One had no choice but to walk away. The circuit was simply too narrow, too rough, and too unforgiving for the growing power and speed of modern F1 cars. Though its setting was majestic, its risks were unacceptable. Charade faded from the championship calendar, and the hills that once echoed with roaring engines fell silent. Today, parts of the old circuit remain open to local traffic, weaving quietly through the volcanic landscape that once defined it. The ghosts of Charade still linger there, a reminder when racing was wild, breathtaking, and as unpredictable as the earth beneath its wheels. 6. Le Mans Bugatti Circuit. The Le Mans Bugatti Circuit stands as one of Formula One's most fleeting experiments, a single appearance in 1967 that was never repeated. Built within the legendary Circuit de la Sarthe, home of the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the Bugatti layout was meant to bring the grandeur of that endurance legacy into the world of Grand Prix racing. It was smaller, safer, and more contained than the terrifyingly fast public roads of the full Le Mans circuit. But when Formula One arrived, it quickly became clear that what worked for endurance racing didn't translate to fiery intensity of F1. The track was short, flat, and narrow, offering little in the way of overtaking or excitement. Drivers found it dull, spectators found uninspiring. The 1967 French Grand Prix, the only one ever held there, proved the experiment's failure. The field spread out quickly, and the race unfolded without drama. Even the mighty Jim Clark, who won with calm precision, admitted afterward that the circuit lacked character. Fans accustomed to the thrilling, high-speed danger of Reims or Clermont-Ferrand felt cheated by the slow, technical rhythm of Bugatti. The organizers hoped the association with the name Le Mans would lend prestige, but the reality was far less glamorous. A track designed for endurance cars, not for sheer explosiveness of Formula One machines. After that race, Formula One quietly abandoned the idea of returning. The Bugatti circuit continued to host motorcycles and local events, but its brief flirtation with F1 became little more than a footnote in history. It wasn't tragedy or scandal that ended its run, just indifference. Today, it remains part of the iconic Le Mans complex, alive in sound and spirit during endurance weekends, yet forever marked as the circuit that tried to host Formula One for a day, and found it wasn't built for that kind of fire. 7. Dijon-Prenois. Dijon-Prenois was a circuit that shone brightly but briefly in the world of Formula One. Tucked away in the Burgundy region of France, it was compact, fast, and exhilarating, a flowing ribbon of tarmac that rewarded precision and bravery. When it joined the F1 calendar in 1974, its elevation changes and sweeping bends quickly won over drivers who loved its rhythm and pace. The track may have been short, but it was intense, and its simplicity allowed pure racing to shine through. Over the years, Dijon hosted several memorable duels, but none more legendary than the 1979 French Grand Prix, the race that gave the world one of F1's greatest battles between Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux. Their wheel-to-wheel fight in the closing laps, full of daring slides and impossible passes, remains etched in history as the perfect embodiment of raw racing passion. Yet, for all its charm and history, Dijon's limitations became impossible to ignore. As Formula One evolved to the late 1970s and early 1980s, safety standards rose. Cars grew faster, and circuits needed more space, both for speed and for survival. Dijon, at just 3.8 kilometers long, was too small to handle the growing complexity of the sport. The pit facilities were outdated, the runoff areas minimal, and overtaking opportunities too few. The circuit that once celebrated pure racing was now seen as restrictive and risky. The same intimacy that once thrilled fans now pose a danger that F1 could no longer afford. By 1984, Formula One had outgrown Déjà larger, more modern circuits like Paul Ricard and the renovated Spa-Francorchamps offered better safety, greater capacity, and global appeal. Dijon faded quietly from the calendar, not because of scandal or tragedy, but because the sport simply moved on. Today, the circuit still hosts local and historic races, a living museum of motorsport memories. And though Formula One never returned, the echoes of that unforgettable 1979 duel still hang in the air, a reminder that even small tracks can produce moments far larger than themselves. 8. Magny-Cours. When Magny-Cours entered the Formula One calendar in 1991, it was meant to symbolize a new era for French motorsport, modern, organized, and forward-looking. Nestled deep in the rural heart of France's Niva region, the circuit was sleek and technical, with smooth corners and a tidy layout that rewarded precision over chaos. For drivers, it offered rhythm and flow. For engineers, it offered a reliable, purpose-built facility away from the hazard of older, more dangerous tracks. But from the very beginning, Magny-Cours carried a flaw that no amount of engineering could fix: isolation. Far from any major city, surrounded by farmland and winding country roads, it was a logistical nightmare for fans, teams, and the media alike. Getting there felt like a pilgrimage, and many decided not to make the journey at all. Despite that, Magny-Cours did host moments of brilliance. It was a stage for Michael Schumacher's dominance in the early 2000s, where Ferrari's red tide often swept across the French countryside in effortless victory. The track's mix of tight hairpins, long straights, and sweeping bends created a kind of understated beauty. Technical rather than thrilling, calculated rather than chaotic. But while the racing was often clean, it lacked the spark that drew crowds elsewhere. Attendance dwindled, hotels were scarce, and the economic burden on organizers grew heavier each year. Even the French government, once supportive of keeping a national Grand Prix alive, began to question the value of hosting it in such a remote corner of the country. By 2008, the writing was on the wall. Formula One had become a global spectacle, expanding into new markets and modern venues with massive fan bases and luxury infrastructure. Magny-Cours, with its quiet countryside charm and modest facilities, no longer fit the vision of a sport chasing glamour and reach. The final French Grand Prix there passed with little fanfare, and the race was dropped from the calendar soon after. Though there have been occasional talks of reviving it, Formula One never returned. Today, Magny-Cours remains active as a testing and racing venue. Still pristine, still precise, a silent reminder when Formula One paused in the middle of France, only to realize that the world had raced ahead without it. 9. AVUS. The AVUS circuit in Berlin was unlike any other track Formula One had ever seen, a monument to both ambition and insanity. Built in the 1920s as part of Germany's pioneering Autobahn system, it was essentially two long, parallel straights connected by sweeping hairpins at each end. The north curve, paved entirely with bricks and steeply banked at nearly 43 degrees, looked more like a wall of death than a racetrack. When Formula One arrived in 1959, it was already clear that AVUS belonged to another time, a relic of pre-war speed trials, not a stage for modern Grand Prix racing. Yet, in that one and only year, F1 drivers were asked to confront it, and what followed was both spectacular and terrifying. At full throttle for nearly half the lap, cars reached speeds well over 270 kilometers per hour before plunging into the towering brick banking, their suspension screaming under the strain. The air was thick with dust and fear, and any mistake meant certain disaster. On that single weekend, tragedy struck when French driver Jean Barra, one of the sport's respected veterans, lost control of his Porsche in a support race. His car hit the wall at high speed, somersaulted over the top, and threw him out, killing him instantly. The gruesome crash sent shockwaves to the paddock and cast a grim shadow over the entire event. Though the main race went on, everyone knew AVUS was a place where survival depended as much on luck as skill. After that weekend, Formula One never returned. The circuit, with its absurd speeds, brick banking, and lack of safety barriers, was simply too dangerous for the new era of the sport. AVUS continued to host touring car races for a time, But even those were eventually abandoned as the demands of safety overtook the allure of spectacle. Today, fragments of the old circuit still exist, now part of a public highway running through Berlin. Silent and unassuming, yet carrying the ghost of that one mad experiment in 1959 when Formula One flirted with death at full speed on a road that was never meant to be a racetrack. 10. Nürburgring Nordschleife. The Nürburgring Nordschleife was more than just a circuit. It was a legend carved into the mountains of Germany's Eifel region, a place that tested not just machines but the very limits of human courage. Known as the Green Hell, its 22 kilometers of twisting, blind corners and brutal elevation changes made it the most challenging racetrack ever built. Drivers described it as both magnificent and merciless. 170 turns winding through misty forests, narrow as a country lane, lined with nothing but trees and guardrails. Every lap was an act of survival. When Formula One first raced there in 1951, the world watched in awe as drivers tamed a beast that punished even the smallest mistake. Victories at the Nürburgring weren't just wins. They were conquests. But by the 1970s, that same mythical danger had become unbearable. Cars were faster, safety standards were higher, and yet the Nordschleife remained a circuit from another time. Marshals had to sprint miles through the forest to reach crash sites, and medical help was often too far away. Then came 1976, the race that changed everything. On August 1st, Niki Lauda, reigning world champion, lost control of his Ferrari on the Bergwerk section of the track. His car burst into flames, and he was trapped inside the wreckage. Fellow drivers, Arturo Merzario, Brett Lunger, Harold Erdeling, Guy Edwards, stopped mid-race to pull him out, saving his life but leaving him with severe burns. The horrifying images of that crash became a turning point for Formula One. Within weeks, the sport decided the Nordschleife was no longer fit for modern racing. The German Grand Prix moved to Hockenheim, and the mighty Nürburgring was abandoned as an F1 venue. In the 1980s, a new Nürburgring emerged beside the old one, the Grand Prix circuit, shorter, safer, and purpose-built for modern Formula One. From 1984 onward, it hosted numerous memorable races, alternating with Hockenheim as the home of the German Grand Prix. It lacked the savage majesty of the Nordschleife, but carried its name proudly, a symbol of evolution rather than nostalgia. Yet by 2020, as Formula One's calendar expanded globally, even the GP circuit was dropped from regular rotation, replaced by newer, flashier venues. Today, the Nordschleife still lives on as a pilgrimage site for drivers and fans, open for public laps and endurance races. Its forests remain eerily quiet except for the echoes of engines past, a living monument to the fine line between heroism and horror that defined an era of Formula One racing. 11. Hockenheimring. For decades, the Hockenheimring stood as Germany's roaring temple of speed, a circuit that blended sheer velocity with electric atmosphere. Carved through the dense Rhine Valley forest, the original layout was a 6.8-kilometer blur of straights connected by chicanes, where engines screamed at full throttle for nearly half the lap. When Formula One first arrived in 1970, the track immediately captured the sport's spirit. Fast, dangerous, and unrelenting. The roar of V10s and V12s echoed through the pine trees, and the crowd's cheers from the stadium section created a contrast between the isolation of the forest and the spectacle of the arena. Hockenheim became synonymous with power, a place where slipstreaming battles and daring overtakes turned races into legendary duels. Yet, as Formula One evolved, the track began to feel like a relic of a wilder time. The long forest sections, breathtaking but remote, made it difficult for emergency teams to respond to accidents, and fans could see little of the action beyond the stadium loop. The death of Jim Clark in 1968 during a Formula 2 race there haunted its history, serving as a constant reminder of the risks that lurk behind its beauty. In 2002, Hockenheim underwent a dramatic transformation. The forest straights were cut away, the track shortened, and the circuit reimagined for modern safety and broadcasting demands. What emerged was safer, more compact, and more commercially viable, but to many purists, it felt as though Hockenheim's soul had been paved over. The new era brought mixed fortunes. While the updated Hockenheimring continued to host thrilling races, including unforgettable wet weather duels and home victories for German heroes like Schumacher and Vettel, the economics of Formula One grew increasingly brutal. Hosting fees soared, government subsidies vanished, and attendance dropped. By the late 2010s, financial strain pushed the circuit to its limits. The German Grand Prix, once a staple of the calendar, began alternating with the Nürburgring, then disappeared entirely as both venues struggled to meet F1's rising costs. Hockenheim's final Formula One race came in 2019, a chaotic, rain-soaked thriller that ended with Max Verstappen's victory and Sebastian Vettel's heroic charge from the back. After that, the engines fell silent. Today, the circuit remains alive with local events and DTM races, but its days as a Grand Prix host are over, a casualty not of danger or scandal, but of economics and evolution. In the quiet of the forest where engines once thundered, Hockenheim stands as a monument to how progress, sometimes, comes at the cost of passion. 12. Pescara Circuit. The Pescara Circuit remains one of the most astonishing and terrifying chapters in Formula One history, a one-time event that pushed the limits of endurance, courage, and common sense. Located along Italy's Adriatic coast, the 25.8-kilometer public road loop was the longest track ever used in a world championship race. It wound through mountain villages, coastlines, and narrow countryside lanes, blending breathtaking scenery with unimaginable risk. The circuit had been used for racing since the 1920s, but when Formula One arrived in 1957, it was already considered a relic of a bygone era, a place where danger wasn't a possibility, but a guarantee. Drivers faced blind corners flanked by stone walls, cliffside drops, and uneven road surfaces that shook their cars to pieces. Every lap was an act of faith, and every mistake fatal. The race itself became a test of sheer survival. Engines strained in the summer heat. Tires blistered on the rough roads, and drivers fought not just for position, but to keep their cars intact. Locals lined the narrow streets, standing terrifyingly close to the passing machines, separated only by ditches or hay bales. Stirling Moss and Juan Manuel Fangio both described Pescara as magnificent and utterly insane. The race was dominated by Moss and his Van Wall, who navigated the chaos with surgical precision, but even his victory could not hide the truth. Formula One had no business racing there again. The risks were beyond control, the safety measures non-existent, and the slightest error could have wiped out driver and spectator alike. After that single Grand Prix, Pescara was quietly retired from the World Championship calendar. Formula One's future lay in purpose-built tracks, not treacherous public roads lined with spectators and stone fences. Over the following years, the circuit faded back into the fabric of the Italian countryside, its roads returning to ordinary traffic, its danger buried under asphalt and memory. Today, the route still exists as a series of peaceful rural roads, but for those who know its history, every bend whispers of that one extraordinary race in 1957, when the bravest drivers in the world danced with death on the longest circuit ever to bear the name Formula One. 13. Mugello. Mugello was never meant to be a Formula One battleground. Yet in 2020, during the chaos of a global pandemic, it became one of the sport's most unexpected and thrilling chapters. Nestled among the rolling Tuscan hills of Italy, the circuit had long been a favorite for MotoGP and Ferrari's private testing, known for its flowing corners, fast elevation changes, and breathtaking scenery. When COVID-19 forced Formula One to scrap much of its calendar, Mugello stepped in as a substitute, hosting its first-ever Grand Prix in September 2020. It was Ferrari's 1,000th race, a poetic coincidence that saw the prancing horse celebrate its legacy on home soil, at a track it knew better than any other. The circuit's high-speed rhythm and blind crest immediately earned praise from drivers who compared it to an old-school challenge, pure and punishing. The race itself, however, was anything but calm. Mugello's narrow layout and unforgiving curves sparked chaos from start to finish, with multiple red flags and dramatic crashes that tested even the most experienced drivers. A massive restart pileup on the main straight early in the race left debris scattered everywhere, while later collisions whittled the field down to just 12 finishers. Lewis Hamilton eventually emerged victorious, but the real story was a spectacle. Mugello delivered a Grand Prix that felt raw, unpredictable, and fiercely physical, a reminder of what Formula One once was before the era of wide runoffs and engineered perfection. Despite the glowing reviews, Mugello's F1 dream ended as quickly as it began. Once the world began to recover and the regular calendar returned, the Tuscan circuit was quietly dropped. Its rural location, limited facilities, and lack of infrastructure made it impractical for permanent inclusion on an already overcrowded schedule. But that single race left an indelible mark. Mugello proved that even in modern Formula One, a circuit could still humble the best, punish mistakes, and leave fans breathless. Today, it remains an active track for MotoGP and testing, standing as a reminder of that strange, uncertain year when the world paused and Formula One rediscovered its wild heart in the hills of Tuscany. 14 Monsanto Park. Monsanto Park in Lisbon hosted just one Formula One Grand Prix, yet its brief appearance in history remains a haunting example of how peril and beauty once shared the same racetrack. Set within a sprawling, tree-filled public park on the outskirts of Portugal's capital, the circuit wound through narrow roads, tight corners, and uneven surfaces that left little margin for error. On paper, it promised a scenic challenge, a race framed by greenery and city skyline. But in reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The trees stood dangerously close to the asphalt. There were no proper barriers, and the road itself was bumpy and inconsistent. When Formula One arrived in 1959 for the Portuguese Grand Prix, drivers immediately realized that the track was as unforgiving as it was picturesque. Throughout the weekend, cars slid perilously close to tree trunks and curbs, and a lack of runoff space turned every corner into a trap. Spectators crowded the edges of the park roads, separated from the passing cars by little more than grass and luck. The combination of high speeds, natural obstacles, and minimal safety measures made the entire event feel like a flirtation with catastrophe. Stirling Moss, Jack Brabham, and other greats of the era managed to navigate the chaos, but the tension was palpable from the first lap to the last. Moss ultimately won. Yet even in victory, drivers and teams voiced grave concerns about the track's dangers. It was clear from that single race that Monsanto Park could never be part of Formula One's future. The layout, while scenic, was hopelessly unsafe, and the park's public setting made it impossible to modify without destroying its natural charm. After 1959, the circuit was quietly abandoned, and F1 never returned to Lisbon. Over time, the roads were reclaimed by everyday traffic, and the park returned to its peaceful existence. Today, traces of the old circuit still wind through Monsanto's trees. Ordinary roads now, whispering the memory of that one extraordinary race when Formula One came to a forest in Lisbon and realized that beauty, in racing, can sometimes be deadly. 15. Boa Vista Street Circuit. The Boa Vista Street Circuit in Porto was a kind of track that defined Formula One's wild and fearless early years. Fast, chaotic, and built on danger. Set along the cobbled streets and coastal avenues of Portugal's second-largest city, the circuit twisted through tight urban corners, tram lines, and patches of rough stone that rattled both cars and nerves. It was a spectacle like no other. Engines echoing through the seaside air, tires skidding across uneven cobblestones, and crowds leaning from balconies to catch a glimpse of the roaring machines below. When Formula One first raced there in 1958, it was both thrilling and terrifying, a test not just of driving skill, but of survival instinct. The challenges at Boa Vista were constant and unforgiving. Drivers battled not only one another but the track itself, dodging tram rails that threatened to pull their cars sideways and navigating bumpy surfaces that offered almost no grip. One misjudged move could send a car hurtling toward the barriers or into the open streets beyond. The circuit's narrow layout left little room for correction, and even the best struggled to stay in control. In 1958, Stirling Moss famously protested against the disqualification of rival Mike Hawthorne for reversing on track, an act of sportsmanship that would later help Hawthorne clinch the championship by a single point. But behind such moments of honor, everyone knew that Boa Vista was a death trap disguised as a racetrack. By the early 1960s, Formula One had outgrown such perilous city circuits. The cobbles, tram lines, and lack of safety zones made Boa Vista increasingly untenable as the cars grew faster and more powerful. After hosting its final Grand Prix in 1960, the circuit was abandoned, left to fade back into the rhythm of city life. The streets that once carried the thunder of Ferrari and Van Wall engines returned to carrying trams, buses, and daily commuters. Yet for those who know their history, Every curve along Porto's Avenida de Boa Vista still holds an echo of a time when Formula One raced on stones and steel, and courage alone separated triumph from tragedy. 16. Estoril. For over a decade, the Estoril circuit was the beating heart of Portuguese motorsport, a sun-drenched stage of speed and spectacle overlooking the Atlantic coast. Opened in 1972 and added to Formula One calendar in 1984, it quickly became a driver favorite for its technical layout, a perfect blend of sweeping bends, sudden hairpins, and long straights that rewarded precision and punished impatience. The circuit's unpredictable winds from the ocean added an extra challenge, making grip and balance a constant battle. It was at Estoril that Ayrton Senna claimed his first-ever Formula One victory in 1985, mastering torrential rain to announce himself to the world with a drive that would become legend. For years, Estoril produced thrilling races, fierce duels, daring overtakes, and championship-defining moments that gave Portugal a proud place in F1 history. But behind the glamour, Estoril struggled to keep up with the rapid modernization of Formula One. By the mid-1990s, the sports safety standards had risen dramatically, demanding better barriers, larger runoffs, and upgraded facilities. Estoril, charming but outdated, couldn't match the expectations. The FIA repeatedly called for improvements, but the costs proved too heavy for the circuit's management and government backers. While other European venues like Barcelona were expanding and new markets in Asia were emerging, Estoril's resources and political will were running thin. The grandstand still filled with passion, but the infrastructure beneath was aging fast. By 1996, time had caught up with the Portuguese Grand Prix. Faced with mounting financial and safety challenges, the race was dropped from the calendar, replaced by newer, better-funded venues that reflected Formula One's global ambitions. Estoril's silence that autumn marked the end of an era. Though it continues to host national and international racing today, the circuit remains frozen in memory as a bridge between the raw, analog era of the 1980s and the sleek professionalism that followed. Its empty main straight and weathered pit buildings still whisper the sounds of V10 engines and Senna's rain-soaked triumph, reminders of when Estoril stood proudly among the giant of Formula One, before progress and profit drove the circus away. 17. Pedralbes Barcelona Street Circuit. The Pedralbes circuit in Barcelona was a glamorous illusion, a glittering showcase of post-war optimism built on public roads that were never meant for the speed and danger of Formula One. Set through the elegant avenues of the Pedralbes district, lined with palm trees, balconies, and cheering crowds, it looked more like a parade route than a racetrack. When Formula One first arrived in 1951, the city embraced it with pride. The Spanish Grand Prix returned to the international stage, and Pedralbes became its beating heart. Drivers hurtled past cafes and apartment blocks at over 250 kilometers per hour, their engines echoing through the streets as spectators packed the sidewalks. It was fast, festive, and thrilling, a symbol of Spain's return to modernity after years of isolation. But beneath the excitement, danger was everywhere. There were no real barriers, no runoffs, and little to separate man from machine. By the time the second Grand Prix was held in 1954, Formula One had changed. Cars were faster, tires grippier, and risks higher, but the circuit had not. The 6.3-kilometer layout remained a network of ordinary roads with open intersections and lampposts just inches from the racing line. Marshals had no radios, ambulances struggled through the crowds, and fans stood frighteningly close to the action. Just a year later, tragedy struck elsewhere. The 1,955 Sierra Leonean Leone's man's disaster claimed over 80 lives when a car launched into the crowd. That single event transformed the world's view of motorsport safety, and Pedralbes instantly became an example of what could never happen again. Formula One officials knew that continuing to race on such streets was courting catastrophe. The Spanish Grand Prix disappeared from the calendar after 1954, and Pedralbes was abandoned, never to host Formula One again. The streets returned to normal life, the roar of engines replaced by the hum of daily traffic. Today, the avenues still exist, still lined with the same buildings that once watched legends like Fangio and Ascari fly past at full speed. Few passers-by realize they are walking on what was once one of the fastest and most dangerous circuits in Formula One history, a place where glamour and recklessness shared the same road, until the world finally decided that spectacle was no longer worth the risk. 18. Montjuic, Barcelona. The Montjuic Street Circuit in Barcelona was a breathtaking blend of beauty and danger, a twisting ribbon of asphalt carved to the public roads of Montjuic Park, overlooking the city and the Mediterranean Sea. When Formula One arrived there in 1969, the atmosphere was electric. Fans lined the streets. The Spanish sun glinted off the cars, and the city came alive with the sound of engines echoing through the trees and stone walls. It was a circuit of contrasts, tight, unforgiving corners bordered by curbs and lampposts, yet surrounded by gardens and grand monuments. For a time, it embodied the romantic chaos of 1970s racing, raw, visceral, and thrillingly unpredictable. But Montjuic's beauty masked a fatal truth. It was a death trap waiting to claim lives. In the lead-up to the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix, tensions were already boiling. Political unrest across Spain mirrored the chaos inside the paddock, where drivers and teams clashed with organizers over the circuit's safety. Barriers were poorly secured, protective fences flimsy and rushed into place. Emerson Fittipaldi even boycotted the race, warning that tragedy was inevitable. He was right. On race day, just 26 laps in, Rolf Stomlin's Hill GH1 suffered a rear-wing failure at terrifying speed. His car veered off the track, vaulted the barriers, and crashed into a crowd of spectators. 5 people were killed, 4 of them instantly, 1 later from injuries, and several others were badly injured. The race continued briefly before being stopped, leaving Johan Mass as a grim winner one of the darkest days in Formula One history. That crash ended Montjuic forever. The circuit was condemned as unsafe, the Spanish authorities faced outrage, and Formula One vowed never to return. The tragedy also marked a turning point for the sport, a painful reminder that spectacle without safety carried an unbearable cost. Montjuic was left to the city, its roads reopening to public life as if nothing had happened. Today, tourists stroll through its park, unaware that those same roads once echoed with the sounds of Formula One, and with the screams of a race that went terribly, tragically wrong. Montjuic stands now as both a memorial and a warning. Beauty can deceive, and even the most stunning circuit can hide unspeakable danger. 19. Jarama. Jarama was born in an era when Spain was desperate to prove itself on the international motorsport stage. Opened in 1967, just north of Madrid, it was designed by the legendary engineer John Hugenholtz, the same man behind Zandvoort and Suzuka. The circuit was tight, technical, and serpentine, a challenging blend of hairpins, blind corners, and constant elevation changes that demanded rhythm over raw speed. When Formula One arrived in 1968, drivers quickly realized Jarama was a circuit that rewarded precision but punished aggression. There was no space for mistakes. Its narrow confines and limited runoffs left little room for overtaking, but plenty for frustration. Still, in its early years, Jarama had a certain charm, a gritty, compact arena that brought Spanish fans close to the heart of the action. The 1970s were Jarama's defining decade, but also its downfall. As F1 cars grew faster and more powerful, the track's tight layout began to feel claustrophobic. It hosted moments of brilliance, including Gilles Villeneuve's unforgettable defensive masterclass in 1981, when he held all 4 faster cars to take his final win. Yet even that glory couldn't hide the circuit's limitations. The facilities were outdated, the pits cramped, and the spectator areas poorly managed. The narrow straights and endless succession of slow corners made racing processional, with overtaking almost impossible. While the Madrid sun and passionate crowds gave it atmosphere, the racing itself was too often decided by qualifying and attrition rather than daring on-track moves. By the early 1980s, Formula One had outgrown Jarama. The sport was expanding into faster, safer, and more commercially viable circuits, and Spain's own motorsport ambitions had shifted southward. In 1986, the newly built Jerez circuit took over as a home of the Spanish Grand Prix, leaving Jarama behind as a relic of F1's wilder, more intimate years. The circuit continued hosting local events and testing, but its era in the global spotlight was over. Today, Jarama remained preserved, its layout unchanged, its grandstands echoing with memories of a time when Formula One was smaller, rawer, and far more personal. The ghosts of Villeneuve Ferrari still dance through its corners, a reminder that even a cramped, twisting track can produce legends that time will never forget. 20. Jerez. Jerez de la Frontera entered Formula One with all the promise of a fresh start for Spanish motorsport. Built in the heart of Andalusia, surrounded by vineyards and olive groves, it was a purpose-designed modern circuit, wide, smooth, and far safer than the twisting relics of Jarama and Montjuic that came before. When it debuted in 1986, it was hailed as Spain's arrival into the new age of Formula One. The track's flowing layout and warm climate gave it distinctive charm, and its first race instantly delivered drama. Ayrton Senna and Nigel Mansell thundered toward the finish line separated by just 0.014 seconds, one of the closest finishes in F1 history. For a moment, it seemed Jerez had cemented its place as Spain's new home of speed. But as the years went on, cracks began to show, not in the tarmac, but in the atmosphere. Jerez's remote location made it difficult for international fans and teams to access, and the surrounding region lacked the infrastructure to support the swelling crowds Formula One demanded. Attendance dwindled, and while the races were often competitive, the grandstands told another story: wide stretches of empty seats under the Andalusian sun. The circuit itself, though well-designed, lacked the character and iconic backdrop that defined Europe's great venues. F1's global expansion in the 1990s only made matters worse. Newer, flashier circuits in Asia and the Middle East drew investment and attention, while Jerez struggled to stay relevant. By 1997, the Spanish Grand Prix had permanently moved to Barcelona's Circuit de Catalunya, and Jerez's chapter in Formula One quietly closed. Ironically, that final race ended in controversy. The infamous showdown between Michael Schumacher and Jacques Villeneuve, when Schumacher attempted a desperate lunge that ended with his retirement and Villeneuve's championship triumph. It was a fittingly dramatic farewell for a circuit that had given the sport so much history in so little time. Afterward, Jerez found new life as one of F1's favorite testing venues, its mild climate and smooth surface perfect for pre-season shakedowns. Today, it still hums with the sound of engines each winter, a reminder when Andalusia briefly became the center of the Formula One world, before the circus moved on, leaving behind echoes of glory beneath the Spanish sun. 21. Valencia Street Circuit. The Valencia Street Circuit was born out of ambition, Spain's attempt to capture the glamour of Monaco and the modern polish of Singapore. Laid out along the city's sun-soaked harbor and marina, it was introduced in 2008 as part of the European Grand Prix Series, promising speed, spectacle, and Mediterranean style. On paper, it had everything: a gleaming waterfront backdrop, bridges crossing the docks, and the hum of F1 engines reverberating between glass towers and yachts. But from its very first race, the circuit struggled to live up to the dream. Though technically demanding, its 25-turn layout produced processional, uneventful racing. Wide runoffs, tight walls, and few overtaking zones made every Grand Prix feel flat. The setting was glamorous, but the spectacle was not. Behind the scenes, the story was even more complicated. The Valencia project cost more than 250 million euros, a staggering sum fueled by government contracts, political deals, and grand promises of tourism and development. But the timing couldn't have been worse. As the global financial crisis hit Spain, the city's economy faltered and unemployment soared, leaving many to question the wisdom of such an extravagant venture. Attendance fell sharply after the first year, and the vast grandstands began to empty, baking under the coastal sun as the roar of the cars failed to fill the void. The race became a symbol of excess, a glittering event masking the reality of economic pain just beyond the circuit walls. By 2012, the end was inevitable. Formula One's global expansion had made hosting fees astronomical, and Valencia's organizers were drowning in debt. The final race, ironically, was one of the best, a chaotic and emotional 2012 European Grand Prix that saw Fernando Alonso storm from 11th to victory in front of his home fans, bringing the city to life one last time. It was a moment of redemption that the track had waited 5 years for, and it came just as the curtain fell. After that, the Valencia Street Circuit was abandoned, its barriers dismantled, and its asphalt slowly reclaimed by weeds and silence. Today, fragments of the old route still snake through the marina, Faded lines of a dream that cost too much and lasted too little. A modern monument to how even Formula One's brightest promises can crumble under the weight of reality. 22 Anderstorp Scandinavian Raceway. Deep in the forests of southern Sweden, the Anderstorp Raceway, officially known as the Scandinavian Raceway, emerged in the 1970s as one of Formula One's most unusual and unlikely destinations. Built on reclaimed marshland and surrounded by pine trees and lakes, it wasn't a glamorous circuit, but a bold national project meant to bring Grand Prix racing to Scandinavia. Its 4-kilometer layout was fast and flat, with a distinctive 1-kilometer straight that doubled as an airstrip, a feature so long that planes had land beside the roaring F1 cars. When the Swedish Grand Prix debuted there in 1973, it captured the nation's imagination. Local heroes like Ronnie Peterson and Gunnar Nielsen turned Anderstorp into a pilgrimage site for fans, and for a few glorious summers, Sweden became the heart of Northern European motorsport. But beneath the excitement, the circuit's remoteness was always a problem. Reaching Anderstorp meant long drives through rural roads, and its limited infrastructure made it difficult for teams, media, and spectators alike. While the racing itself could be thrilling, thanks to its sweeping bends and unpredictable weather, the crowds began to thin as the novelty wore off. Formula One, increasingly global and commercial, found little appeal in a venue that was charming but costly. Still, for a time, the Swedish Grand Prix thrived on passion alone. Drivers admired its unique character, and fans embraced it as a rare chance to see the sport up close in a country that adored its motorsport heroes. Then tragedy struck. In 1978, during that year's race weekend, Swedish driver Gunnar Nielsen had already been forced to withdraw due to his battle with cancer, and only weeks earlier, Ronnie Peterson, Sweden's beloved racing icon, had lost his life after a crash at Monza. The twin losses devastated the local racing community. Combined with declining attendance, financial strain, and the logistical nightmare of transporting the entire Formula One circus to such an isolated corner of Europe, the Swedish Grand Prix quietly disappeared from the calendar after 1978. Anderstorp never hosted Formula One again. Today, the circuit still exists, used for national racing and testing, surrounded by the same forest that once echoed with the sound of F1 engines. It remains a solemn symbol of a fleeting golden era when Sweden briefly stood among the great racing nations, before distance, economics, and heartbreak brought the dream to an end. 23. Bremgarten. The Bremgarten circuit in Switzerland was a haunting masterpiece, a track of speed, beauty, and danger intertwined. Located just outside Bern, it was never purpose-built for racing, but evolved from forest roads that twisted and curved through dense trees and flickering shadows. The layout was fast, flowing, and utterly unforgiving. When Formula One first visited in 1950, the drivers were captivated by its rhythm, blind corners that rose and fell to the landscape, patches of sunlight that broke through the canopy, and surfaces that changed from asphalt to cobblestone without warning. It was a circuit that demanded instinct more than precision, a place where bravery often mattered more than control. Yet, behind its elegance lay peril. Bremgarten offered no runoff areas, no barriers, and little mercy for mistakes. In wet conditions, it became a nightmare, slippery, dark, and lethal. During the early 1950s, Bremgarten hosted the Swiss Grand Prix and quickly gained a reputation as one of the most challenging tracks in the world. But that reputation came at a cost. Several fatal accidents marred its history, including the death of popular Swiss rider Hans Stuck during a motorcycle race, and multiple tragedies involving drivers who lost control in the forest shadows. Even the greats, Fangio, Ascari, Farina, spoke of the track with respect laced with fear. Still, Bremgarten remained a beloved stop on the F1 calendar, drawing thousands of fans from across Europe who lined the trees and hillsides to glimpse their heroes flash by in moments of blur and thunder. Then, in 1955, everything changed. During that year's Le Mans 24 Hours, a catastrophic crash killed more than 80 spectators, sending shockwaves across the world of motorsport. In its aftermath, the Swiss government took a drastic step. It banned all forms of circuit racing within its borders. Bremgarten, despite its legacy and beauty, was silenced overnight. Formula One never returned, and the once revered track faded back into the forest from which it had been carved. Today, The trees have reclaimed its asphalt, and only faint traces of the old road remain, hidden beneath leaves and soil. Bremgarten's story is one of haunting finality, a reminder that sometimes the roar of engines grows too loud for the world to bear, and even the greatest circuits can vanish in the name of safety and sorrow. 24. Aintree. Aintree, nestled on the outskirts of Liverpool, was a circuit born from an unlikely marriage of speed and tradition. Built around the same grounds as the famous Aintree Racecourse, home of the Grand National Horse Race. It was designed in the early 1950s as Britain's answer to the glamorous circuits of Europe. When Formula One arrived in 1955, Aintree quickly became a favorite among fans for its accessibility and lively atmosphere. The track, flat and fast, wound through grandstands and grassy infields, with spectators able to watch large sections of the race unfold from a single vantage point. It was there, in 1955, that Stirling Moss claimed his first ever Grand Prix victory, a historic win that made him the first British driver to triumph on home soil in a British car. For a moment, Aintree was at the very center of British motorsport glory. Yet, beneath its charm, Aintree carried flaws that soon became impossible to ignore. The circuit was narrow, bumpy, and shared space with the horse racing grounds, meaning safety upgrades were limited and racing schedules constantly juggled to accommodate both worlds. As the speeds of Formula One cars increased through the late 1950s, the track's modest design began to feel dangerously outdated. Its flat corners offered little protection in the event of crash, and its dual-purpose layout left little room for expansion or modernization. By the early 1960s, Silverstone, with its airfield heritage and greater capacity for upgrades, had become the natural home of the British Grand Prix. Aintree's final Formula One race came in 1962, closing a brief but memorable chapter in the sport's history. Though it faded from the world stage, the circuit continued to host national and club-level events for years afterward, serving as a proving ground for young British talent. Today, most of the original racing layout has been repurposed, with sections of the track still visible near the horse racing complex, ghostly reminders of the days when Formula One cars once thundered past the grandstands built for galloping horses. Aintree's story is one of transition, a track that bridged the post-war era of optimism with the dawn of modern racing, only to be left behind when progress demanded something safer, faster, and more enduring. 25. Brands Hatch. Brands Hatch was the beating heart of British motorsport, a circuit that pulsed with passion, drama, and danger. Nestled in the wooded hills of Kent, it began as a simple dirt bike track in the 1920s before evolving into one of the most beloved racing venues in the world. When Formula One first came to Brands Hatch in 1964, alternating with Silverstone as host of the British Grand Prix, the atmosphere was electric. The track's natural amphitheater design meant spectators could see much of the action unfold before them, and its flowing corners, Paddock Hill Bend, Druids, Hawthorne, demanded absolute precision from drivers. Unlike the flat, open airfields of Silverstone, Brands Hatch was intimate and unforgiving, with elevation changes that made every lap feel alive. It was a circuit where skill mattered as much as bravery, and where legends like Clark, Hunt, Lauda, and Mansell wrote unforgettable chapters in F1 history. But beneath its charm, the very things that made Brands Hatch magical also sealed its fate. The circuit's narrow width and lack of expansion space made it increasingly unsuitable for modern Formula One cars, which were growing faster and wider with each decade. Safety upgrades were costly and difficult to implement without tearing into the surrounding hills and forests. The venue's rural location, once its greatest allure, became a limitation as access roads clogged with race day traffic and local residents grew weary of the deafening noise that echoed across the Kent countryside. By the late 1970s, the complaints mounted, and so did the pressure to modernize or move on. When Silverstone underwent major renovations in the 1980s, Formula One's loyalty shifted decisively. Silverstone's open landscape allowed for longer straights, better runoff areas, and a kind of global-scale infrastructure that Brands Hatch simply couldn't match. The final Formula One race there in 1986 was both thrilling and bittersweet. Nigel Mansell claimed victory before a sea of Union Jacks, marking the end of an era. After that, the Grand Prix never returned. Yet, Brands Hatch refused to fade away. It remains one of the most iconic and challenging circuits in motorsport, a place where the ghosts of Formula One still linger in the trees and echoes of engines still haunt the bends. Though modern safety standards pushed aside, the soul of racing never left. At Brands Hatch, it still hums quietly beneath the roar of every car that dares to chase history. 26. Donington Park. Donington Park holds a special, almost mythical place in Formula One history. Not because of how long it hosted the sport, but because of what happened in its single, unforgettable race. Set in the rolling countryside of Leicestershire, England, Donington had long been a beloved circuit among racers for its smooth, flowing corners and natural rhythm. When it was selected to host the 1993 European Grand Prix, replacing a canceled event elsewhere, few expected it to deliver one of the most legendary performances the sport had ever seen. That cold, rainy April afternoon became the stage for Ayrton Senna's masterpiece, a drive so brilliant it still echoes through the decades. As the lights went out, Senna started fourth on the grid behind Alain Prost, Damon Hill, and Michael Schumacher. Within the opening lap, a single mesmerizing lap, he passed all three, gliding through the rain-slick track with an almost supernatural sense of control. It became known as the Lap of the Gods. Throughout the race, while others struggled for grip, spun, or pitted repeatedly for tires, Senna danced through the mist, winning by over a minute. It was a kind of performance that transcended sport, a moment when man, machine, and nature seemed perfectly in sync. For Donington Park, it was a pinnacle, the day it joined the pantheon of F1 legends. But as spectacular as that race was, Donington's return to Formula One was short-lived. The circuit lacked the financial muscle and facilities needed to host regular Grands Prix. Its rural location limited expansion, and after the 1993 event, organizers struggled to meet the escalating costs of F1's commercial demands. Plans to bring the race back fell apart amid money troubles and shifting priorities. By the time Donington resurfaced in discussions years later, Formula One had moved on to larger, more global venues. The European Grand Prix never returned to its quiet Leicestershire hills. Today, Donington remains a cherished circuit for fans and drivers alike, hosting touring cars, superbikes, and historic events. But it's remembered above all for that one magical, rain-soaked afternoon in 1993, when Ayrton Senna turned a gray English day into a piece of eternal Formula One legend. 27. Buenos Aires, Autodromo won by Oscar Galvez. Few circuits in Formula One history have mirrored a nation's story as vividly as Buenos Aires. The Autodromo, later named after Argentine racing legends Juan and Oscar Galvez, was a symbol of Argentina's pride, resilience, and turbulence. When it first hosted Formula One in 1953, the country was riding a wave of optimism under President Juan Perón. The grandstands were packed, the atmosphere electric, and the circuit layout, a complex network of fast straights and sweeping corners, reflected the daring spirit of the age. It was here that Juan Manuel Fangio, Argentina's own national hero, rose to global fame, turning Buenos Aires into a cathedral of speed. The heat shimmered off the tarmac, the air thick with passion, and for a time, Argentina stood proudly among the great nations of Formula One. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the circuit became a fixture of the calendar, hosting races across several different configurations. Its versatile design allowed for changes in length and layout, with variants like Circuit Number 6 becoming fan favorites for their rhythm and challenge. But by the late 1970s, the cracks in Argentina's economic and political landscape began to show. Inflation soared, infrastructure crumbled, and the cost of hosting a Formula One Grand Prix grew unbearable. In 1981, amid economic collapse and civil unrest, the Argentine Grand Prix was canceled and the circuit fell silent. What had once been a source of national pride now stood as a relic of a fading golden era. The track's grandstands empty, its future uncertain. Against all odds, Buenos Aires made a triumphant return in 1995. The government and sponsors rallied to revive the event, and for 4 brief years, the sound of Formula One engines once again echoed across the Pampas. The circuit had been modernized, the facilities updated, and local fans, still fiercely devoted to racing, filled the stands with hope. But the joy was short-lived. By 1998, political instability and renewed economic hardship swept through Argentina, making the cost of hosting the Grand Prix unsustainable once more. Formula One quietly withdrew, this time for good. 28. Jacarepaguá, Rio de Janeiro. Jacarepaguá, officially known as the Autodromo Internacional Nelson Piquet, was once the crown jewel of Brazilian motorsport, a sun-soaked temple of speed lying between the mountains and lagoons of Rio de Janeiro. When Formula One first arrived in 1978, it offered a striking contrast to Sao Paulo's gritty Interlagos. Jacarepaguá was smoother, faster, and better suited to the increasingly powerful turbocharged cars of the 1980s. With long straights and flowing corners, it quickly became a driver favorite, offering breathtaking rhythm and punishing heat in equal measure. The circuit seemed to shimmer under the tropical sun as the roar of F1 engines echoed across the waterfront, a spectacle that made Rio, for a time, the capital of global motorsport. Throughout the decade, Jacarepaguá hosted some of Brazil's most iconic races. Home heroes like Nelson Piquet and Ayrton Senna turned the track into a cauldron of passion, with fans packing the grandstands under blazing skies. The atmosphere was electric. Samba drums in the distance, flags waving, and the scent of salt water drifting through the humid air. Yet, despite the passion, Jacarepaguá faced growing challenges. Its location on reclaimed marshland meant the surface deteriorated quickly, and the humid climate wreaked havoc on the asphalt. Financial struggles and political wrangling over funding made maintenance increasingly difficult. By the late 1980s, Formula One's eyes were turning back to Interlagos, which had been refurbished and modernized to meet the sport's rising standards. The final Formula One race at Jacarepaguá came in 1989, marking the end of an era. The circuit remained active for national events and even MotoGP, but its fate was sealed years later when Rio won the bid to host the 2016 Olympic Games. In a twist of irony, the once revered raceway was demolished to make way for the Olympic Park, its asphalt replaced by arenas and athlete housing. Today, not a single trace of the circuit remains, only street names and memories to mark where champions once roared to the Rio heat. Jacarepaguá may be gone, but its spirit endures in Brazil's racing soul, a symbol of an age when the world's fastest cars met the rhythm of Rio, and together they burned bright under the tropical sun before vanishing into history. 29. Mosport Park. Mosport Park, now known as Canadian Tire Motorsport Park, was Canada's first true home of Formula One, and embodied both the country's rugged beauty and the sport's untamed danger. Carved into the rolling hills of Ontario, just outside Toronto, the circuit was a natural wonder, fast, flowing, and fiercely technical. Its sweeping corners and blind crests made it a driver's circuit in every sense, demanding courage and instinct. When Formula One debuted there in 1967, fans lined the grassy slopes to watch legends like Clark, Hill, and Stewart wrestle their cars through the undulating bends. The atmosphere was electric. The smell of oil and pine, the roar of engines bouncing off the forested hills, and the pride of a nation finally seeing itself on the global motorsport stage. But Mosport's beauty was deceptive. The same elevation changes and natural contours that made it thrilling also made it lethal. The track had almost no runoff areas, meaning even the smallest mistake could end in disaster. Armco barriers sat frighteningly close to the racing line, and several of the corners, like Turn 2, a long, blind downhill left-hander, became infamous for claiming both cars and lives. The surface was rough and uneven, and the facilities were primitive by Formula One standards. As the 1970s progressed and F1 speeds climbed, Mosport's charm began to look like recklessness. The circuit hosted a string of terrifying incidents, including Jackie Stewart's fiery crash in 1967 and multiple fatal accidents in support races that underscored the track's deadly potential. By 1977, the writing was on the wall. Formula One had outgrown Mosport's danger, and safety had finally become a non-negotiable part of the sport. After the last Grand Prix that year, a race won by Jody Scheckter, F1 moved to the newer and slightly safer Mont-Tremblant circuit for a brief period before settling permanently in Montreal, where the modern Canadian Grand Prix found its lasting home. Mosport remained active in national and endurance racing, evolving slowly with improved safety features, but it never returned to the Formula One calendar. Today, it stands as one of the sport's most hauntingly beautiful ghosts, a circuit that gave Canada its first taste of Grand Prix glory, and a reminder of the days when speed ruled over safety and courage alone was the price of survival. 30. Mont-Tremblant. Mont-Tremblant, Nestled in the Laurentian Mountains of Quebec, was one of the most scenic yet challenging circuits ever to host Formula One. The track, officially known as Circuit Mont-Tremblant, cut through pine forests and rugged hillsides, creating a natural roller coaster of sweeping curves, sharp elevation changes, and fast straights. When Formula One first arrived in 1968, drivers were awestruck by its beauty, a circuit framed by lakes and mountains, unlike anything else on the calendar. But they were also wary. The undulating terrain demanded total precision. The surface was bumpy and unpredictable, and the slightest error could end in disaster. Still, for those few years, Mont-Tremblant embodied Canada's racing spirit, raw, wild, and breathtakingly fast. However, the circuit's remote location soon became its greatest flaw. Nestled deep in the Quebec wilderness, getting to Mont-Tremblant was a logistical ordeal for teams and fans alike. Transporting cars, equipment, and personnel through the narrow mountain roads proved both costly and exhausting. The weather added to chaos. Cold, rain, and sudden fog often turned the race weekends into unpredictable battles against nature itself. Even though the circuit earned respect for its technical challenge, the lack of infrastructure and accessibility made it unsustainable for a growing, increasingly global Formula One. By 1970, Formula One had moved on. The Canadian Grand Prix found a new home at Mosport and later, permanently in Montreal, leaving Mont-Tremblant behind as a beautiful but impractical dream. The circuit, however, never truly died. It was lovingly restored decades later and remains one of North America's most beloved racing venues for sports cars and testing. Surrounded by pine forests and mountain air, Mont-Tremblant stands today as a frozen memory of a time when Formula One flirted with nature and learned that beauty alone could not tame the wilderness. 31. Sebring, 1959. Sebring International Raceway, tucked into the flatlands of Central Florida, was never meant for the precision and fragility of Formula One machinery. Yet, for a brief moment in 1959, it became the unlikely stage for a World Championship finale. Converted from a World War II airbase, Sebring's long concrete runways and service roads formed a harsh, punishing circuit that tested both man and machine. Its surface was brutally bumpy, stitched together from aging airfield slabs that rattled suspensions and punished tires. When Formula One arrived for the season-ending United States Grand Prix, drivers were met with a strange mix of endurance racing heritage and raw American enthusiasm. The tropical heat shimmered off the concrete, and fans packed into makeshift stands, eager to witness the sport's first true U.S. round. The race itself was historic, but not for reasons of perfection. The rough surface shook cars to pieces, and dust clouds from the surrounding fields hung heavy in the humid air. Jack Brabham famously ran out of fuel while leading on the final lap, pushing his Cooper across the line to secure both the championship and a place in F1 folklore. Behind the spectacle, however, teams were unhappy. The bumpy, uneven surface was treacherous. Visibility was poor in some sections, and the wide, airfield layout lacked the finesse and flow expected of a Formula One circuit. It was an experiment that felt more improvised and professional, an enthusiastic American welcome that came at the cost of precision and comfort. After that single Grand Prix, Formula One never returned. The organizers had lost money, the teams had lost patience, and Sebring's rugged charm was deemed far better suited to endurance racing than the delicate demands of F1. Indeed, that's exactly what it became, the spiritual home of the 12 Hours of Sebring, one of the world's great endurance events. Today, the old runways still rumble with engines every March, and the ghosts of 1959 linger there, reminders of the day Formula One tried a race on a wartime airfield, found it too rough to handle, and left behind a piece of its history in the Florida heat. 32. Riverside. Riverside International Raceway, set amid the arid hills of Southern California, was a circuit born from American ambition and wide-open space. Long before it became a legend in U.S. motorsport, it hosted one fleeting chapter of Formula One history, the 1960 United States Grand Prix, a race that was as bold as it was brief. The track itself was pure Americana, a sprawling, sun-bleached expanse of asphalt winding through desert scrub, with vast elevation changes and fast, sweeping corners that punished both tires and bravery. When Formula One rolled into Riverside, it was meant to showcase the glamour of European racing to an American audience. But the desert heat, logistical challenges, and the sheer distance from major cities made it clear that this was a world apart from Monaco or Monza. The race took place under a blistering California sun, with temperatures soaring and dust clouds swirling off the surrounding hills. The circuit's high-speed corners thrilled drivers but terrified teams, who struggled with overheating engines and fading brakes. Stirling Moss dominated that day, his Cooper Climax carving through the shimmering heat to take victory. But the grandstands told a different story. They were half empty. Riverside was simply too remote, too expensive, and too unfamiliar for American crowds still discovering the European-style Grand Prix format. The organizers lost money, and many in the paddock swore the championship would never return to such an isolated venue. After 1960, Formula One packed up and moved east to Watkins Glen, where the U.S. Grand Prix found a long and stable home. Riverside, meanwhile, became a beloved playground for American racing, hosting Can-Am, Trans-Am IndyCar, and NASCAR for decades. Its sweeping corners like Turn 9 and the Essies became iconic among drivers who loved its old-school danger. But in 1989, progress caught up with it. The land was sold, the circuit bulldozed, and a shopping complex rose in its place. Today, nothing remains of the desert circuit that once tried to bring Formula One to the American West, except a few fading photos and the memory of a race that burned bright, hot, and brief under the California sun. 33. Watkins Glen. Watkins Glen was the beating heart of Formula One in America for 2 decades, a place where autumn leaves met roaring engines and small-town charm met global spectacle. Nestled in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York, the circuit began humbly, carved from farmland and forest roads by racing enthusiasts who simply loved the sport. When Formula One first arrived in 1961, the Glen, as it was affectionately called, offered something uniquely American: crisp mountain air, sweeping natural corners, an atmosphere that blended competition with community. Drivers adored it. The fast, flowing turns of the original 3.7-mile layout rewarded skill and courage, and the fans, often camping for days in the surrounding fields, created an atmosphere that was both rowdy and intimate. By the 1970s, the United States Grand Prix at Watkins Glen had become one of the highlights of the F1 calendar. But as the years went on, the cracks began to show, both literally and financially. The track surface began to crumble, patched together with quick fixes instead of proper resurfacing. Facilities lagged behind Formula One's rising standards, and the organizers struggled to keep up with escalating costs. Worse still, the management's finances began to unravel. By the late 1970s, drivers were voicing open concerns about safety after multiple high-speed accidents, including the fatal crash of Francois Cevert in 1973 and Helmut Koenig in 1974, both at the same section of the track, the treacherous Essies. Despite minor improvements, the Glen's reputation was tarnished, and whispers began to spread to the paddock that the sport had outgrown its rustic home in New York. The final blow came not from tragedy, but from money. After the 1980 Grand Prix, it was revealed that several teams had not been paid their prize money, a sign of deep financial trouble behind the scenes. The circuit fell into bankruptcy soon after, closing its gates and leaving behind empty grandstands and overgrown corners. Formula One never returned. For a while, it seemed the Glen might vanish entirely, another victim of ambition without means. But racing passion runs deep in upstate New York. The track was revived in the years that followed, re-emerging as a world-class venue for sports cars and IndyCar. Today, the sound of engines still echoes through the hills, but the ghosts of Formula One remain. Reminders of an era when the Glen was not just a race, but a festival of speed, friendship, and the relentless heartbeat of American racing. 34. Long Beach. Long Beach was a circuit that proved Formula One could belong in the heart of an American city. Born from a bold idea to bring Grand Prix racing to California's coast, the Long Beach Street Circuit transformed an ordinary port district into a roaring amphitheater of speed. When F1 first arrived in 1976, palm trees swayed above the barriers. The Pacific shimmered in the distance, and the sound of engines echoed off the downtown skyscrapers. It was a visual spectacle, glamorous, sunny, and unmistakably Californian, and quickly became known as the Monaco of America. The track itself was tight, bumpy, and technical, demanding absolute precision as drivers snaked between concrete walls and across uneven surfaces. It was dangerous but intoxicating, a perfect mix of chaos and charm that captured everything Formula One was meant to be. Through the late 1970s and early 80s, Long Beach became one of the most beloved stops on the calendar. It was here that Mario Andretti thrilled his home crowd with victory in 1977, cementing his place in F1 history. The event blended Hollywood glamour with raw street racing energy. Film stars mingled with mechanics. Luxury yachts lined the harbor, and California's golden sun gave every photograph a touch of magic. But beneath the glitter, the financial strain was growing. Hosting Formula One was immensely expensive, and the logistical demands of bringing the global circus to the city each year weighed heavily on organizers. The American fan base loved the spectacle, but not always enough to fill the seats at European prices. By 1983, the promoters made a pragmatic but painful decision. Formula One, with its spiraling fees and political complexity, would be replaced by the rapidly growing kart/IndyCar series. The switch was immediate and successful. The Long Beach Grand Prix thrived under its new banner, drawing crowds, sponsors, and stability that F1's economics could no longer provide. Formula One never returned, but the race itself endured, evolving into one of the longest-running and most successful street circuits in the world. Today, the streets of Long Beach still come alive every spring with the sound of engines, carrying echoes of that golden F1 era, when California, for a brief and brilliant time, became the glamorous frontier of the world's fastest sport. 35. Caesars Palace, Las Vegas. The Caesars Palace Grand Prix in Las Vegas was Formula One's most extravagant gamble, and one that lost spectacularly. When organizers announced that the championship would race in the parking lot of the famous Caesars Palace Hotel and Casino, many thought it was a joke. But in 1981, under the blazing Nevada sun, it became reality. The makeshift circuit wound through temporary barriers and concrete walls, laid out over the asphalt expanse behind Casino, with little more than palm trees and grandstands to disguise its humble origins. Formula One came to Las Vegas chasing glamour and American showmanship, bright lights, celebrity crowds, and the promise of turning racing into a global entertainment spectacle. Instead, it became one of the strangest and most punishing events in the sport's history. The track itself was tight, flat, and utterly devoid of character. A 14-corner maze squeezed into a few city blocks. Drivers hated it. The coarse desert heat pushed cockpit temperatures past endurance levels, and the constant direction changes shredded tires and exhausted bodies. Spectators baked in the stands as shimmering waves of heat rose from the tarmac, and even the mechanics wilted in the relentless sun. The atmosphere felt artificial. Formula One cars roaring through a parking lot, while the casinos nearby drowned out the noise with slot machines and music. Yet in that first year, the race carried enormous importance. It was a season finale that decided the 1981 World Championship, with Nelson Piquet clinching his first title after an exhausting duel that left him nearly fainting at the finish. By 1982, the novelty had worn off. The drivers still loathed the layout. The fans were indifferent, and the heat remained brutal. Even the casinos that had initially backed the project began to lose interest as attendance figures dropped. Formula One's Grand Las Vegas experiment ended after just 2 years, its dream of merging speed with Sin City glamour melting away under the desert sun. The circuit was dismantled soon after, leaving behind nothing but faded asphalt and the lingering irony of its name. Caesars Palace, a monument to luxury, had hosted one of the least glamorous races in F1 history. Yet in its failure, it became a legend, a cautionary tale of ambition gone too far, and proof that no amount of glitter can hide the heat of a bad idea. 36. Detroit Street Circuit. The Detroit Grand Prix was born out of America's industrial pride. Formula One roaring through the city that built the car itself. Set against the gritty skyline of downtown Detroit, the street circuit wound its way past the Renaissance Center and along the Detroit River, a concrete jungle of tight corners, unforgiving barriers, and rough, patchwork asphalt. When F1 arrived in 1982, the symbolism was powerful. The world's greatest racing machines competing in the heart of the Motor City. But while the setting carried poetry, the reality was brutal. The circuit was bumpy, narrow, and endlessly demanding. Drivers wrestled their cars over manhole covers, bumps, and surface changes, with every mistake punished by cold concrete. It was less a race and more a street fight, a test of endurance in sweltering summer heat. Despite its flaws, Detroit had character. The skyline, the crowds, and the sense of struggle gave a raw energy that fit the era's rugged spirit. Yet, over time, the charm wore thin. The track's technical layout produced processional racing. Overtaking was nearly impossible, and the relentless surface broke suspensions and tempers alike. The organizers struggled with logistics and safety improvements, while Formula One, expanding rapidly into global markets, began to see Detroit as more trouble than it was worth. By 1988, the sport's patience ran out. The city's infrastructure couldn't keep up with F1's demands, and negotiations collapsed. The race was dropped from the calendar the following year and relocated to Phoenix, Arizona, another American street experiment that would soon face its own fate. Detroit's circuit faded back into its streets, leaving only the echo of engines between the empty office towers and the ghost of the time when Formula One came to America's industrial heart and found itself fighting the city as much as the track. 37 Dallas Fair Park. If Detroit was tough, Dallas was madness. The 1984 Dallas Grand Prix was staged inside Fair Park, the historic Art Deco complex in the heart of the city at the height of Texas summer. It was meant to be a showcase, F1 under the American sun, a glamorous southern spectacle of speed. Instead, it became one of the most infamous races in the sport's history. Temperatures soared to nearly 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, baking the temporary street circuit until the asphalt literally began to melt. The surface broke apart under the car's downforce, sending chunks of tarmac flying and turning corners into chaos. Drivers spun helplessly on the crumbling surface, and the pit crews worked under scorching heat that tested endurance more than engineering. Nigel Mansell's day summed up the race perfectly. After collapsing from exhaustion while trying to push his dead car across the finish line, he fainted beside the track, the Texas heat finally beating even his iron will. Ayrton Senna's car overheated. Niki Lauda crashed, and only 8 cars finished the race. Alain Prost won, but victory came more through survival than speed. The event was a logistical and environmental disaster. Though fans loved the spectacle, the drivers were unanimous. Never again. Formula One agreed. The Dallas Grand Prix was never repeated, joining Caesar's Palace in Riverside as another one-off American misadventure. Fair Park returned to its quiet life of concerts and exhibitions, but for that one blistering weekend in 1984, it became the hottest place on Earth, literally and metaphorically, in the world of Formula One. 38 Phoenix Street Circuit. The Phoenix Street Circuit was meant to be Formula One's grand American comeback, a new foothold in the U.S. after the chaos of Detroit and Dallas. Set amid the grid-like streets of downtown Phoenix, Arizona, it was designed to bring Formula One closer to the American public while showcasing the sleek, futuristic image the sport was chasing at the dawn of the 1990s. But from its very first race, the dream began to wilt under the desert sun. The circuit, a temporary layout of tight 90-degree corners and baking tarmac, lacked both excitement and spectacle. The Arizona heat was merciless, the grandstands half empty, and the television cameras captured more shimmering asphalt than cheering crowds. The debut race in 1989 was staged in June, in temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Engines overheated, drivers wilted in their cockpits, and tires blistered on the melting surface. Ayrton Senna, the reigning world champion, led easily until mechanical failure handed victory to Alain Prost. But the real story was survival, not speed. In subsequent years, the race was moved earlier in the season to avoid the heat, but even that couldn't save it. The downtown layout offered little overtaking, and the city streets, lined with concrete walls and chain-link fences, lacked the glamour or energy that Formula One thrived on elsewhere. The locals, unfamiliar with the sport's European flavor, barely showed up, and TV audiences around the world tuned out. By 1991, the writing was on the wall. The event lost money. The city grew weary of the disruption, and Bernie Ecclestone, ever pragmatist, saw no future in Phoenix. The final race came and went with little fanfare, marked only by Ayrton Senna's dominant win and the eerie emptiness of the grandstands. After 3 years, Formula One left the desert and set its sights west, to the glittering promise of a new circuit in California, one that would take root decades later in Austin's Circuit of the Americas. Today, nothing remains of the Phoenix track but the ordinary city streets that once formed its outline, hot, flat, and silent. For 3 brief years, they echo with the sound of Formula One engines, a reminder that even the best intentions can melt away under the relentless desert sun. 39. Ain Diab, Casablanca, Morocco. The Ain Diab circuit in Casablanca was a fleeting but fascinating chapter in Formula One's early history, a race born from post-colonial optimism and ended by political unrest. Laid out on public roads along Morocco's sun-bleached Atlantic coast, the 7.6-kilometer circuit swept past the ocean, palm groves, and desert edges, blending beauty with peril. When Formula One arrived in 1958, Morocco was newly independent and eager to showcase itself to the world as a modern, forward-looking nation. The event promised international prestige in the setting, glamorous yet unforgiving, felt almost cinematic. But beneath the surface shimmered instability, both political and practical. The circuit was fast, narrow, and lined with curbs and open ditches, offering little in the way of safety. Drivers faced long straights interrupted by tight, bumpy corners, and the Atlantic winds carried sand across the tarmac, turning the course into a slippery gauntlet. The 1958 Moroccan Grand Prix was both thrilling and tragic. It was the final race of the championship, with Britain's Mike Hawthorn and Stirling Moss locked in a tense title fight. Moss drove brilliantly, winning the race, but it was Hawthorn who secured the world championship by a single point, the first Briton ever to do so. Yet the triumph was overshadowed by horror. On lap 41, British driver Stuart Lewis Evans, a close friend and teammate of Moss, suffered a mechanical failure that sent his van wall spinning off the road and bursting into flames. He was pulled from the wreck with severe burns and died days later from his injuries. The tragedy cast a dark cloud over the event and over the entire Van Wall team, which withdrew from Formula One soon after. That race marked both a beginning and an end, the first and only time Morocco hosted a Formula One Grand Prix. Political tensions were rising in the region. The logistics of racing on public roads proved too dangerous, and the death of Lewis Evans sealed the circuit's fate. Formula One never returned. Ain Diab faded back into the rhythm of Casablanca's traffic, its asphalt absorbed once more into the city's coastal roads. Today, the ocean still crashes beside the route where engines once screamed, a silent witness to the day Formula One came to North Africa and left behind a story of ambition, tragedy, and the haunting beauty of speed on borrowed streets. 40. Prince George Circuit, East London, South Africa. The Prince George Circuit in East London was where South Africa first carved its name into Formula One history, a picturesque seaside track with sweeping turns and a salt-tinged breeze off the Indian Ocean. Built on public roads that loop through rolling dunes and open coastal stretches, the 3.9-kilometer circuit was both fast and deceptively dangerous. When Formula One arrived in 1962, the setting was stunning: blue skies, golden light, and the sea glimmering beyond the barriers. Local hero Jim Clark quickly turned the venue into his personal kingdom, claiming multiple victories and stamping his legend on African soil. For the drivers, the circuit offered a unique mix of speed and rhythm, but also the unsettling realization that a mistake here meant ending up in the sand or worse. Despite its charm, Prince George was always a fragile jewel. The circuit's remote location in the small port city of East London made travel expensive, and the infrastructure struggled to keep pace with the growing demands of international racing. The facilities were basic, and access roads barely fit the convoys of trucks and equipment needed for a world championship event. Political tension in apartheid-era South Africa added another layer of uncertainty. Global sentiment toward the regime was shifting, and motorsport's presence in the country was increasingly controversial. Formula One, which was beginning to embrace television and global branding, found East London both geographically and politically isolated from its future. By 1965, the end was clear. The South African Grand Prix moved inland to the brand-new Kyalami circuit near Johannesburg, modern, central, and built to the standards of a changing sport. Prince George was left behind, its legacy sealed as a relic of Formula One's adventurous early years. Today, parts of the old circuit still exist, repurposed for local racing and amateur events. The sea still crashes nearby, and the wind still whispers through the dunes where Formula One once roared. Prince George remained a symbol of beginnings, the place where South Africa's Grand Prix dream first took flight before being swept inland by time, politics, and progress. 41. Kyalami. Kyalami was more than just a circuit. It was the soul of South African motorsport, a track that rose with ambition and fell under the weight of history. Built in the Highveld Hills north of Johannesburg, Kyalami, meaning my home in Zulu, made its Formula One debut in 1967 and instantly captivated drivers with its sweeping curves, fast straights, and thin, high-altitude air that tested engines to their limits. The circuit's flowing layout demanded bravery and balance, rewarding those who could dance through corners like Barbecue Bend and Sunset Curve with precision and nerve. In its early years, Kyalami was a glamorous stop on the F1 calendar, sun-drenched, festive, and fiercely competitive. It was here that legends like Jim Clark, Jackie Stewart, and Niki Lauda etched their names into history, and where the roar of engines echoed to the South African summer. But beneath the racing glory, a darker shadow grew. By the late 1970s, the apartheid regime had turned South Africa into a global pariah. International protests and political pressure mounted against any sport that continued to compete there. Formula One found itself in a moral and political storm, tore between tradition and conscience. In 1985, the final straw came when the South African Grand Prix faced widespread boycotts. Several teams, including French and Swedish manufacturers, withdrew under government pressure. That year's race went ahead but fell hollow, surrounded by tension and controversy. It was the last F1 event held in South Africa under apartheid rule. Afterward, sanctions deepened, and F1 severed ties completely. The engines fell silent, and Kyalami, once a jewel of the circuit calendar, faded into isolation. The years that followed were unkind. Without Formula One, revenue vanished, and the circuit's finances crumbled. By the early 1990s, after the end of apartheid, there was hope for revival, and indeed, Formula One returned in 1992 and 1993. But the new era was short-lived. The event's costs were immense. Sponsors were scarce, and South Africa's recovering economy couldn't sustain the financial burden. The track was sold soon after, its grandstand slowly decaying as international racing moved on. Eventually, Kyalami was redeveloped, shortened, and modernized for a GT and touring car series, surviving as a proud but quieter echo of its former glory. 42. When the Yas Marina circuit opened in 2009, it felt like Formula One had stepped into the future. Built on Abu Dhabi's man-made Yas Island, it was a marvel of architecture and ambition, a place where the desert met luxury, where engines howled beneath the glowing shell of the Yas Hotel, and where the race began in sunlight and ended beneath the stars. Every corner shimmered with extravagance. The marina lined with yachts, the grandstands filled with dignitaries, and the night sky alive with light. Yas Marina wasn't just a circuit, it was a statement. Proof that Formula One had become a global spectacle, not just a sport. It was a new jewel in the crown, the perfect symbol of a modern, polished era. For over a decade, it served as a grand finale to the Formula One season, the stage for world championships to be won and lost, tears shed, and legends crowned. It was here that Sebastian Vettel, Lewis Hamilton, and Max Verstappen wrote defining moments in their careers, all beneath the golden haze of Arabian twilight. Yet, as the sport evolved and the calendar expanded into new territories, from Jeddah to Las Vegas to Qatar, the once shining glamour of Yas Marina began to fade. The track, though beautiful, was criticized for its lack of overtaking, its sterile precision, its predictable races. Even after major redesigns, it could not escape the growing feeling that Formula One had outgrown it, that the world had moved on to chase newer, louder dreams. Now, as Formula One prepares for another chapter with new circuits rising across the Middle East and beyond, Yas Marina stands like a monument to an era that once defined progress. Its floodlights still burn bright, but the novelty that once set it apart has dimmed. It isn't abandoned in the physical sense. The cars still race, the crowds still cheer, but its soul feels quieter, its importance slowly replaced by fresher ambitions. Once the symbol of Formula One's future, Yas Marina has become a relic of its golden past, still shimmering in the night, but no longer the brightest star in the sky. 43. Lusail International Circuit. Lusail International Circuit in Qatar burst onto Formula One scene in 2021, shimmering beneath the desert floodlights as the sport's newest night race. Long, flat, and surrounded by empty sand and silence, it was built for MotoGP, but repurposed for F1's growing Middle Eastern presence. The setting was surreal, a sea of light in the middle of the desert, engines echoing across the dunes while the air hung thick with heat. Drivers praised its smooth, sweeping flow. Yet even in its debut, there was a sense of sterility, of a track more impressive in photographs than in feeling. Formula One had found another glittering showcase of wealth and ambition. But like others in the region, Lusail struggled to capture the raw soul of racing. By 2023, the cracks began to show not in the asphalt, but in endurance. The extreme desert heat, even under the floodlights, pushed drivers and tires beyond their limits. That year's race became infamous when several competitors nearly collapsed from exhaustion, while tire failures and safety concerns forced mid-race interventions. What should have been a smooth, polished night of modern spectacle turned into a chaotic battle of survival. The race was dramatic, yes, but for all the wrong reasons, a reminder that no amount of engineering could outsmart nature. Qatar's conditions, beautiful but brutal, were testing Formula One's limits in ways that no simulation could predict. By 2024, whispers grew louder that Lusail's future on the calendar was uncertain. With new circuits rising in the Middle East, Jeddah, Las Vegas, Abu Dhabi, even rumored expansions elsewhere, Formula One no longer needed a track that punished both man and machine. The decision to rotate venues among regional hosts quietly pushed Lusail aside, its brief reign fading as quickly as it had begun. Today, it stands as a gleaming monument to ambition, a track that shone bright for a moment in the desert night before the heat, the politics, and the shifting sands of Formula One's future buried it in memory. 44. Adelaide Street Circuit. The Adelaide Street Circuit was a masterpiece of atmosphere, a sunburnt carnival of speed and chaos set in the heart of South Australia's capital. When it debuted in 1985, it marked a new chapter for Formula One. A city transformed into a festival where downtown streets became a roaring stage for the world's fastest cars. The layout was challenging and distinctive, a fast, bumpy blast through parklands and tight corners, framed by grandstands bursting with color and energy. The Australian summer heat shimmered off the tarmac, and fans, famously rowdy and passionate, turned each Grand Prix into a celebration. Adelaide's season-ending slot gave it an air of finality. It was where championships were crowned, where tempers flared, and where legends fell. Few circuits captured Formula One's drama quite like this one. Adelaide's history is written in moments of glory and heartbreak. It was here that Nigel Mansell's title hopes literally burst in 1986, his tire exploding down the straight as his world championship slipped away in seconds. It was here, too, that Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost collided in 1990, sealing another chapter of their fierce rivalry, and where in 1994, Senna's haunting final race weekend preceded the sport's darkest tragedy at Imola just 1 week later. The circuit was brutal, demanding absolute commitment from drivers and machines, yet was adored by all who raced there. Its fast, unforgiving nature and festive crowds gave it an energy unlike anywhere else. An old-school street circuit with the soul of a gladiatorial arena. But politics, not passion, ended Adelaide's reign. By the mid-1990s, Melbourne state government had secured the Formula One contract in a push to reposition itself as Australia's sporting capital. Despite protests, Adelaide's Grand Prix was stripped away after 1995, its final race remembered as both triumphant and bittersweet. Damon Hill dominated that day, taking victory as fireworks filled the sky and fans wept in stands. When Formula One moved to Melbourne the following year, the circus continued, sleeker, wealthier, but somehow less alive. Adelaide streets returned to peace, but for those who remember, the echoes remain. The smell of fuel and eucalyptus, the roar of engines bouncing off the parklands, and the memory of a city that once closed its roads to open its heart to Formula One. 45. Booth International Circuit. The Booth International Circuit was meant to be India's grand entrance into the world of Formula One, a bold statement that the country, with its billion-strong population and rising global presence, was ready to take its place among motorsport's elite. Opened in 2011 just outside New Delhi, the track itself was a marvel. Smooth, sweeping corners, dramatic elevation changes, and a design by Hermann Tilke that drew praise from drivers across the grid. The layout flowed beautifully. Fast straights, blind crests, and a rhythm that rewarded precision and courage. Sebastian Vettel dominated all 3 races held there, carving perfect laps under the hazy Indian sun. But even as the cars thundered down the long back straight, something about it felt fragile, a dream built on shaky ground. Behind the glamour of its debut, the circuit was mired in bureaucratic headaches and political tension. Confusion over whether Formula One qualified as a sport or an entertainment event led to crippling tax disputes that hounded the organizers from the start. Customs delays stranded equipment, sponsorship payments fell through, and state-level corruption allegations cast long shadows over the management. What was meant to be a showcase of India's modern ambition became tangled in the country's labyrinth of red tape and financial infighting. Teams complained about logistics, local authorities clashed over duties and permits, and the optimism of that first weekend in 2011 slowly gave way to frustration. By 2013, the writing was on the wall. Despite the circuit's excellence and the fans' genuine enthusiasm, Formula One could no longer ignore the chaos behind the scenes. The contract was suspended indefinitely, citing political and financial complications. Though everyone knew it was the taxes and the politics that killed it, the paddock packed up, the gates closed, and with international faded into silence after only 3 Grands Prix. Today, the track still stands, immaculate, empty, and eerily preserved, a ghost of what might have been. The desert wind blows across its perfect corners, and the grandstands stare out at nothing, a monument to ambition undone by bureaucracy. For a brief, brilliant moment, India raced with the world. And then, just as quickly, the world moved on. 46, TI Ida. TI Ida, officially known as the Okayama International Circuit, was Japan's forgotten experiment in Formula One. A small, secluded track tucked deep within the forested hills of Okayama Prefecture. When it joined the calendar in 1994, the world expected another Suzuka. Fast, thrilling, and unpredictable. What they got instead was a quiet, remote venue so far from major cities that even the teams joked about getting lost on the way. The track itself was short and technical, with slow corners and little room for overtaking. It rewarded precision more than daring, producing races that felt restrained, almost muted compared to the spectacle of Japan's other circuits. Yet, for all its shortcomings, TI Ida had a strange charm. Its tranquil setting and gentle curves stood in stark contrast to the chaos and politics that often surrounded Formula One. The first race in 1994 should have been a celebration of Japan's growing motorsport legacy, but unfolded under the long shadow of tragedy. The season was still reeling from Ayrton Senna's fatal crash at Imola, and the championship battle that year carried a sense of unease. Michael Schumacher won in dominant fashion, while fans, who had traveled for hours through winding mountain roads, looked on from packed stands surrounded by mist and pine. The following year brought more of the same, quiet, controlled racing that lacked the spark F1's global audience expected. The location's isolation made logistics a nightmare, with teams forced to haul equipment across narrow rural roads, and fans struggling to find accommodation in what journalists call the middle of nowhere. By 1996, the sport had made up its mind. The Pacific Grand Prix was dropped, and TI Ida faded from the world stage, replaced once again by the grandeur of Suzuka. Formula One never returned, and the small circuit slipped back into local use, hosting domestic races and endurance events far from the spotlight. Today, the track remains almost unchanged, its tarmac quiet, its grandstands half forgotten, surrounded by the same green hills that once echoed faintly with the sound of Formula One engines. TI Aida's story is that of ambition colliding with geography, a place too peaceful, too remote to ever truly hold the world's attention. 47, Fuji Speedway. Fuji Speedway was always a place where beauty and tragedy collided. Nestled at the foot of Mount Fuji, its sweeping vistas and long, misty straights made it one of the most picturesque circuits in the world, a racetrack framed by Japan's sacred mountain and surrounded by quiet forests. When Formula One first came there in 1976, the setting seemed perfect, almost cinematic. But the debut race would become one of the most dramatic and haunting in the sport's history. Under torrential rain and near-zero visibility, drivers faced sheets of water and blinding spray that turned the track into a river. It was a day Niki Lauda, still scarred from his near-fatal Nürburgring crash, withdrew after just a few laps, unwilling to risk his life again. James Hunt pushed on, finishing third and winning the World Championship in what would become one of Formula One's most iconic races. Yet the chaos of that storm foreshadowed something darker. The following year, 1977, Fuji hosted its second Grand Prix, and tragedy struck. A collision between Gilles Villeneuve and Ronnie Peterson sent Villeneuve's car into the crowd, killing 2 spectators. The event left a deep scar on Japan's racing community, and Formula One quickly withdrew, shifting its focus to Suzuka, a circuit that would go on to define Japan's place in F1 history. For 3 decades, Fuji lay dormant to the world's premier series, its legend surviving only through old photographs and the memory of those storm-soaked races beneath the shadow of Mount Fuji. When Formula One returned in 2007, the track had been completely redesigned and modernized by Toyota, which now owned it. The mountains remained, but the magic felt different. Safer, cleaner, but strangely soulless. Once again, the rain returned, turning the race into a near repeat of 1976, with drivers aquaplaning through fog and spray. In 2008, the final race there descended into chaos with first-lap collisions and confusion. By 2009, Formula One returned permanently to Suzuka, where heritage and fan culture ran deeper. Fuji, despite its beauty, had lost its place. Today, it continues as a thriving venue for domestic racing and endurance events, standing quietly under the mountain, a haunting reminder of how history, tragedy, and the elements can shape the fate of even the most beautiful circuit on Earth. 48. Sepang International Circuit. When the Sepang International Circuit opened in 1999, it marked the beginning of Formula One's modern era in Asia. Built on the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia's capital, it was the first major circuit designed by Herman Tilke, a sweeping blend of wide straights, technical corners, and open grandstands beneath the humid tropical sky. Sepang was everything F1 wanted at the turn of the millennium: bold, modern, and exotic. Its architecture, with the now iconic palm-shaped grandstand, symbolized the country's growing ambition to stand alongside the world's elite. The inaugural Malaysian Grand Prix was a spectacle of rain, speed, and unpredictability, cementing Sepang's reputation as one of the most technically demanding and weather-dependent tracks on the calendar. The monsoon rains could arrive without warning, transforming races into thrilling battles for survival. For nearly 2 decades, Sepang produced unforgettable moments. It saw Michael Schumacher's return to dominance, Fernando Alonso's early triumphs, and Sebastian Vettel's emergence as a superstar. Drivers loved his challenge. The double apex corners, long straights, and punishing humidity tested both man and machine. Fans, too, found something special in its raw authenticity. The circuit's tropical storms, blistering heat, and unpredictable drama made every Grand Prix feel alive. But as the years went on, Formula One changed. Newer circuits in Singapore, Bahrain, and Abu Dhabi began to steal the spotlight, offering glitz, night racing, and luxury hospitality that Sepang's more modest charm couldn't match. Attendance began to fall, and the once-packed grandstand started showing empty patches of silver under the blazing sun. By 2017, the numbers no longer made sense. Hosting fees had skyrocketed, television audiences were dropping, and the Malaysian government, which had funded the event since its inception, decided to withdraw support. The 2017 race became a bittersweet farewell, marked by emotion and nostalgia from fans and drivers alike. When the lights went out for final time, it felt like the end of an era, not just for Malaysia, but for Formula One's early adventure into Asia. Today, Sepang remains one of the most respected circuits in the world, hosting MotoGP and local championships, its perfect tarmac still shimmering beneath the tropical heat. But its absence from F1 leaves a quiet void, a reminder when the sport's heart raced to the rhythm of thunder, rain, and tropical wind. 49. Korea International Circuit. The Korea International Circuit was supposed to herald Formula One's grand arrival in Northeast Asia, a futuristic complex that would transform the rural town of Yongam into a global motorsport destination. When it opened in 2010, the vision was staggering. A circuit that would wind through a brand new city with waterfront hotels, shopping districts, and luxury apartments rising around it. But even before the first cars took the track, cracks began to show, literally and figuratively. The venue was rushed completion. The surrounding city was still a field of mud and cranes, and the entire project sat precariously on reclaimed swampland. On race weekend, helicopters hovered over unfinished buildings, and the smell of wet concrete hung in the air. The Korean Grand Prix began not as a celebration, but as a warning, a story of ambition outpacing reality. The inaugural race itself was chaos. Torrential rain turned the track into a river, delaying the start and pushing visibility to near zero. Cars slid helplessly through the puddles, and the event that was meant to showcase Korea's technological prowess instead became a mud-soaked endurance test. Yet, for all its troubles, the circuit wasn't bad. Its long straights and technical midsection offered real potential. Drivers praised parts of its layout, but the infrastructure around it was a disaster. Hotels were hours away, access roads flooded, and spectators faced endless traffic just to get in and out. The promised city never materialized. Instead, the circuit stood alone amid fields of swamp grass and unfinished foundations, its grandstands echoing in the stillness. By 2013, the dream had collapsed. The government and organizers were drowning in debt, unable to justify the $400 million spent on a project that brought neither tourism nor prestige. Promised investors vanished, the planned urban development stopped dead, and Formula One quietly withdrew. The circuit, barely 4 years old, became a ghost monument to overreach, a gleaming facility surrounded by nothing but silence. Today, it remains largely abandoned, occasionally used for testing or local events. Its wide, perfect asphalt baking beneath the Korean sun. The weeds grow tall between the paddock buildings, and the empty grandstands overlook a wasteland that once promised to be Korea's Monaco. The Korea International Circuit stands as one of F1's most haunting failures, a $400 million reminder that in the race between ambition and reality, asphalt alone can't build a legacy. 50. Istanbul Park. Istanbul Park was a circuit built for greatness, a modern masterpiece carved into the rolling hills outside Turkey's largest city. When Formula One first raced there in 2005, it immediately won the hearts of drivers and fans alike. The layout was a work of art, fast, flowing, and fearless, with a legendary Turn 8, a quadruple apex left-hander that tested neck muscles and bravery in equal measure, quickly becoming one of the most celebrated corners in modern racing. Set against a backdrop of mosques, bridges, and the meeting point of Europe and Asia, Istanbul Park embodied everything Formula One claimed to be: global, daring, and spectacular. The inaugural race was hailed as one of the best of the season, and the track's natural elevation changes gave it a rhythm and soul that few modern circuits could match. But as the years passed, Turkey's dream of becoming a motorsport powerhouse began to fade. The circuit, though brilliant on track, struggled off it. Crowds dwindled, ticket prices soared, and the remote location, miles from Istanbul's vibrant center, made access a constant challenge. Political tensions within the country grew, and government support began to wane. Behind the scenes, disputes over hosting fees spiraled out of control. By 2011, the organizers were unable to meet Formula One's financial demands, and the Grand Prix contract was terminated. The track, which had cost over $200 million to build, was sold to private investors and fell into semi-retirement, hosting only local and minor international events. Then, almost a decade later, Istanbul Park made an unexpected comeback. In 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic reshuffled the racing calendar, Formula One returned to Turkey out of necessity, and the track reminded everyone of its brilliance. The race, run on a newly resurfaced circuit slick with rain, produced chaos and magic in equal measure, culminating in Lewis Hamilton's 7th world title. A year later, it returned again, briefly rekindling the old spark. But as the world reopened and normal schedules resumed, Istanbul was quietly dropped once more. Its revival had been a temporary flash of nostalgia, a reminder what Formula One once was before politics, money, and circumstance took it away. Today, Istanbul Park remains a modern classic without a home, a perfect circuit stranded by imperfection beyond its borders. 51. Sochi Autodrome. Sochi Autodrome was built to Project Power, a gleaming monument to modern Russia, carved at the heart of the 2014 Winter Olympic Park. When Formula One first arrived, the atmosphere was heavy with symbolism. The wide, polished streets wound past grand arenas and fountains, their perfect symmetry reflecting a country eager to show itself on the world stage. The circuit itself, fast and smooth but somewhat sterile, offered the illusion of grandeur more than the thrill of true racing. Its sweeping corners and long straights favored strategy over spectacle, yet the sight of cars gliding beneath Olympic rings and steel domes gave the Russian Grand Prix a sense of scale few could ignore. For the government, it was a political triumph. For the sport, a logistical marvel. For the fans, oh, it was complicated, a race admired for its precision, but rarely for its passion. Over 8 seasons, Sochi became a fixture of Formula One's late calendar, delivering moments of both tension and drama. Lewis Hamilton dominated the circuit, taking multiple wins as Mercedes made the track their fortress, while the venue's unpredictable weather occasionally breathed chaos into otherwise orderly races. The 2021 event, where rain transformed the final laps and Lando Norris's heartbreak became Hamilton's 100th career victory, proved Sochi could still surprise. Yet even as it found its place on the map, criticism never faded. Drivers called the layout dull. Fans found the racing forgettable. Still, year after year, the race returned, until politics caught up with the sport. In 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine brought everything to an abrupt end. Sanctions swept through international sport, and Formula One terminated its contract with Sochi immediately. The planned move to a new track near St. Petersburg was canceled before construction could finish. Just like that, the Russian Grand Prix was erased, not by economics or design, but by war. The Sochi Autodrome remains intact, its grandstands overlooking the same quiet park where Olympic crowds once cheered and F1 cars once screamed through the corners. Yet it stands now as a ghost of modern politics, a reminder that in Formula One, as in the world beyond the track, no circuit is ever truly immune from the tides of history.